The mountain air held a sharpness that cut through the silence of the chalet, a stillness that felt less like peace and more like a held breath. Outside, the French Alps stood as an impenetrable wall of shadow and ice, sealing the corporate retreat from the rest of the world. Inside, the luxury lodge was a tomb of polished mahogany and glass, where the floorboards hid secrets far more lethal than the sub-zero temperatures waiting just beyond the threshold. Topher had arrived with a plan, a digital architecture that promised to rewrite the rules of data ownership, but he never left the mountain. When the avalanche finally settled, the rescue team found the chalet standing. Yet the internal order had been shattered. It was not the snow that had claimed him. The evidence left behind whispered of a calculated, intimate betrayal that defied the logic of the storm. As the investigation unfolded in the dim, flickering light of the lounge, it became clear that the locks were intact, the windows were sealed, and yet the victim had been moved with impossible precision. The crime scene did not merely suggest a murder. It screamed of a ghost who knew every ventilation shaft and hidden passage by heart. Looking back at the sequence of that night, the discrepancies in the security logs stood out like a jagged scar across the timeline. Welcome to Swasti Diaries, where we dissect the anatomy of the impossible, peering into the shadows where the most dangerous human motives reside. The chalet stood as a monument to success, yet beneath the polished wood and the scent of aged cedar, the atmosphere was suffocating. Topher had gathered the team under the guise of a strategy retreat, but the real intent was to consolidate control over a data harvesting operation that operated in the gray zones of global law. The champagne corks popped in the lounge, a hollow sound against the vast, indifferent silence of the mountains. Nobody spoke of the ledger, the physical manifestation of their digital sins, but everyone felt its weight. As the night deepened, the thin air seemed to amplify the friction between the partners. Marcus kept glancing at his watch, his knuckles white against his glass, while Sarah maintained a facade of efficiency that felt increasingly brittle. Elena remained the quiet observer, the peacemaker whose presence smoothed over the sharp edges of their corporate paranoia. Yet, looking back, the cracks were already wide enough to swallow them whole. The security logs recorded a seamless flow of activity, but the physical environment told a contradictory story of movement that the digital trail failed to acknowledge. Every locked door and every silent hallway was a lie. The stakes were never just about market share or intellectual property, they were about the survival of the architects behind the code. When the first shadow fell across the threshold, it was not an intruder from the outside world who crossed it, but someone who knew the exact frequency of the chalet's heartbeat. The question that haunted the investigation was simple. How did a secure room become a prison for a man who knew every exit? The storm outside intensified, turning the chalet into an island of wood and glass adrift in a sea of white. When the power flickered and died, the silence that followed was absolute. Topher had stepped out into the biting cold to inspect the perimeter, or so he claimed, but the logs told a different story. He never reached the lower slope. Instead, we found his tracks, or what remained of them, abruptly terminating near the ventilation intake. The snow around the intake was undisturbed, a pristine, mocking canvas of white that defied the laws of physics. If he had walked away, the wind would have filled his footprints within minutes, yet the ground remained strangely preserved. It was the first contradiction that shattered the illusion of an accident. The climbing gear found near the intake was not his. It belonged to a high-altitude set we had not touched since our arrival. Looking at the iron-wrought grate, now hanging by a single rusted screw, the logic became inescapable. Topher did not die in a natural avalanche. He was taken from within, lured into a space that functioned as a gateway between the rooms. As the temperature inside the chalet plummeted, the central heating system groaned, a metallic rhythmic thumping that echoed through the vents. It sounded less like machinery and more like a heartbeat, steady and artificial. The ledger, which Sarah swore was locked in the safe, lay open on the library table, its pages fluttering in the draft. Someone had been here, moving through the structure like a ghost in the wires, and the security logs, previously so pristine, now displayed a glaring, impossible gap between 2 a.m. and 3 a.m. The sequence of events was no longer a mystery. It was a carefully orchestrated execution. The silence within the chalet was no longer a void. It was a testament. Looking back at the perimeter, the avalanche debris lacked the chaotic scatter of a natural slide. Instead, the snow near the ventilation intake appeared packed down, as if the earth itself had been forced to hold a weight it was never meant to sustain. Topher did not wander into the storm. He was lured. The misplaced climbing gear, a high-altitude harness found discarded in the hallway, provided the first structural link in this grim puzzle. It was not merely misplaced. It was a deliberate staging, a false trail meant to suggest a departure that never occurred. The harness was clean, devoid of the grit and ice one would expect from a man who had supposedly hiked the ridge line. This contradiction shifted the focus from the storm outside to the architecture within. Someone had used the ventilation shafts to navigate the chalet, bypassing the security logs that Sarah had so carefully curated. The impossibility of the alibis crumbled under the weight of this simple physical fact. If the killer could move between rooms without triggering a door sensor, then the entire retreat was a closed-loop trap. I found myself staring at the library vent, noting the faint metallic scrape on the inner rim where a heavy object had been dragged through. The question was no longer who had the opportunity, but who had the technical knowledge to navigate the internal guts of this building. As the heating system cycled, the vibration caused the loose grate to rattle, a rhythmic, mocking sound that suggested the killer was never truly far from the scene of their work. If the climbing gear belonged to Topher, why was the harness found in the hallway still perfectly cinched to a waist size that could never have fit him? As I held the strap, the buckle clicked, a hollow, accusatory sound in the silence of the corridor. This equipment did not belong to the victim. It belonged to the chalet's own maintenance lead, a man supposedly accounted for in the staff quarters all evening. The contradiction shattered our assumption that we were trapped alone with our own secrets. If a staff member had been moving through the ventilation shafts, then the security logs were not just corrupted. They were a deliberate, calculated fiction designed to keep us confined to our rooms. I looked back at the library vent, noting the faint metallic scrape on the inner rim where a heavy object had been dragged through. The gear was a prop, a clumsy attempt to paint a picture of a desperate escape that never happened. Someone had accessed the internal guts of the building to orchestrate this chaos, and they had relied on our collective paranoia to keep us from checking the staff registry. The truth was far more clinical than any of us had dared to imagine. We were not victims of a random accident or an external intruder. We were being managed. As the heating system cycled, the vibration caused the loose grate to rattle, a rhythmic, mocking sound that suggested the architect of this nightmare was never truly far from the scene of their work. The air inside the chalet grew stagnant as the realization settled in. Our collective survival was no longer the priority. Marcus, his hands trembling as he poured a drink, avoided eye contact with Sarah. The silence between them was not one of grief, but of calculation. Every founder in that room had a personal stake in the company's valuation that dwarfed the value of human life. I watched as their eyes flickered toward the ledger on the sideboard, a physical manifestation of their corruption. Sarah's earlier insistence on the Avalanche theory seemed more like a desperate narrative construction than a genuine belief. The internal paranoia was palpable. If the maintenance lead had been compromised, then anyone could have been the architect. I recalled the way Elena had steered the conversation away from the ventilation shafts hours earlier, her tone far too calm for a woman trapped in a death trap. Was she protecting the secret, or was she the one who had facilitated the movement through the walls? The logs were a fiction, but the motives were terrifyingly real. Each of us had a secret that required the others to remain silent, or in the case of Topher, to remain permanently absent. I looked at the fireplace, where the embers were dying, casting long erratic shadows across the room. The logic was tightening around us like a noose. If the killer had used the internal infrastructure to move, they had to be someone who knew the schematics intimately. As the floorboards creaked in the hallway, I realized that the danger was not just in the walls. It was sitting at the table with us, waiting for the next move. The power failure did not plunge us into darkness. It plunged us into clarity. As the hum of the chalet's electrical grid died, the silence that followed was absolute, broken only by the rhythmic ticking of a grandfather clock that now seemed far too loud. I looked down at the ledger Sarah had been guarding. It was not merely a record of corporate assets. It was a roadmap of exploitation. The entries detailed a systematic data harvesting operation that Topher had intended to expose to the press at exactly midnight. The timing hit me with the force of a physical blow. Topher did not die because of an accident. He died because he was the only one with the keys to the digital vault. I scanned the room, noticing Marcus's knuckles turned white as he gripped his glass, his eyes darting toward the ventilation grate that sat slightly askew near the ceiling. The math was simple and terrifying. If Topher were gone before the leak, the company's internal rot could be buried under the guise of an avalanche. But the murderer had made a critical error in their calculation. They had assumed the ledger was stored only on the central server, failing to account for the physical backup Topher had hidden in the study. By killing him, they had inadvertently drawn attention to the very secret they were desperate to protect. We were trapped in a room with the killer who now realized their motive was sitting in plain sight. And the ventilation shaft behind the mahogany paneling provided the perfect, unseen conduit to strike again. The walls were closing in, and the air felt thinner with every passing second. The master suite door was locked from the inside, a deadbolt that required a key only the victim possessed. Yet, when we forced the heavy oak frame, the room stood silent and empty of life, save for the chilling confirmation that our predator did not need to walk through doors. Sarah lay motionless on the velvet chaise, her final act a desperate attempt to shred the very ledger she had been protecting. I knelt by the baseboard near the walk-in closet, my flashlight beam catching the telltale scratch marks on the brass plating of the ventilation shaft. It was the same mechanism I had noted in the study. The killer was not an outsider. The killer was one of us, a person who knew the structural weaknesses of this chalet better than the architects themselves. The realization hit with a cold, clinical precision. Marcus stood by the window, his reflection ghostly against the black glass, his hands trembling as he realized his alibi, the locked door, was now our strongest evidence against him. He had banked on the impossibility of the crime to mask his movements, but the dust patterns inside the vent shaft betrayed a recent hurried passage. We were no longer investigating a series of accidents. We were documenting a systematic purge. Every person in this room had a reason to kill, but only one had the intimate knowledge required to traverse the crawl spaces. As the wind howled against the exterior stone, I understood that the killer was not just hiding among us. They were actively managing the crisis to ensure their own survival. The discovery of the ledger did more than confirm the motive. It dismantled the illusion of our collective innocence. As I thumbed through the weathered pages of Marcus's private notebook, the jagged reality of his situation emerged. For 6 months he had been systematically bled dry. The entries were not merely financial. They were records of a digital extortion scheme that pinned his entire future to the silence of the boardroom. He had coded the backdoor for Topher, yes, but he had become a prisoner of his own creation. The ledger revealed that Sarah had known about the vulnerability from the start, using it as a leverage point to siphon company funds while keeping Marcus on a short, suffocating leash. It was a classic trap of corporate greed, where the predator and the prey were inextricably linked by the same illicit code. I looked back at the ventilation grate. The scratches were not just marks of passage. They were the scars of a desperate man trying to reach the server room to wipe his tracks before the audit hit. Marcus was not the mastermind. He was the primary suspect because he was the only one with the technical key to the kingdom, yet he was too terrified to use it. The realization shifted the weight of the investigation. We were tracking a killer who treated people as disposable assets, someone who moved through the shadows of the chalet not out of fear, but out of a cold administrative necessity to scrub the ledger clean. The silence in the room deepened, broken only by the rhythmic ticking of a wall clock that seemed to mock our slow realization of the truth. The case against Sarah seemed airtight as the pre-dawn light struggled against the frosted glass of the chalet windows. We found the forged financial documents tucked behind the floorboards in her suite, each page laden with signatures that mimicked the CEO's hand with chilling precision. For an hour, the logic held firm. Sarah was the embezzler, the one who had driven Topher to the edge of the cliff to secure her silence. It was a neat, satisfying narrative. It explained the motive, the access, and the cold-blooded efficiency of the early crimes. I sat in the dim light of the study, tracing the ink lines on the forged ledger, ready to close the file on the entire affair. Then the rhythm of the ink flow caught my eye. I held the page up to the glow of the desk lamp, observing the pressure points of the pen. The forgery was too deliberate, too perfect in its symmetry. It lacked the erratic, hurried tremor of someone acting under the immediate pressure of a murder investigation. More importantly, the ink utilized in the signatures was a specific archival blue, a shade that had been discontinued by the company's supply chain 3 years prior. Sarah had no access to these legacy materials, yet the ink was fresh enough to have been applied within the last 48 hours. The realization was sharp and immediate. We were not looking at an embezzler trying to cover her tracks. We were looking at a carefully constructed plant designed to lead us into a dead end. Someone was guiding our suspicion, and they had made one fatal, elegant mistake. The forgery was a diversion, a smoke screen intended to keep us staring at a desk while the real architecture of the crime remained unseen. I pivoted away from the forged ledger and returned to the primary source of truth, the chalet's internal security logs. These logs were digital ghosts, records of every movement within the facility that we had initially dismissed as glitch-prone. When I cross-referenced the server timestamps against the group's established alibis, the fragility of their narrative fractured. The system recorded a series of door sensor activations that were physically impossible, given the participants' stated locations. Doors in the East Wing opened and closed in rhythmic, 3-minute intervals, yet the individuals associated with those rooms were confirmed to be in the dining hall during those exact windows. The logs did not indicate an intruder. They indicated a mastery of the building's internal infrastructure. Someone had bypassed the electronic locks, not through brute force, but by manipulating the central control hub located inside the ventilation shafts. My focus shifted to the maintenance panels. I realized then that the killer never had to walk the corridors to commit the acts. By utilizing the crawl spaces, they effectively turned the entire building into a weaponized labyrinth. The logs revealed a sequence of entries that began at midnight and ceased just before the first light touched the peaks. A cold, calculated timeline that mapped the killer's path from Topher's suite to the service exits. The investigation had been chasing shadows in the hallways, while the architect of this chaos was moving through the walls themselves. The question no longer concerned who had the motive to lie, but who possessed the technical knowledge to make the building lie for them. The reconstruction of that night revealed a chilling level of spatial awareness. By mapping the chalet's internal grid, I realized that the ventilation system was not merely a series of ducts. It was a private transit network. While the others huddled in the dining hall, distracted by the rising storm and the forged ledger, the killer moved with calculated ease. The logs confirmed that the temperature sensors within the East Wing ducts spiked in specific, localized patterns, a byproduct of body heat moving through confined, insulated spaces. It was not a breach of the perimeter, but a subversion of the interior. The killer entered the maintenance shafts through the basement, bypassed the locked security doors by manipulating the electronic pulse regulators, and emerged inside the target rooms without ever stepping into a hallway. The rhythm of these movements was precise, timed to the minute intervals between the security system's automated status pings. Each entry point, the loose floorboard in the utility closet, the detached grate behind the library shelves, was a calculated node in a broader, lethal architecture. The killer did not just hide from us. They existed in the blind spots of our own construction. As I traced the path from the server room to Topher's suite, the pattern became undeniable. The killer had mapped the building's weak points long before the retreat began. turning our supposed sanctuary into a theater of movement that defied physical detection. The final piece of the puzzle lay not in the motive, but in the specific tool used to bridge the gap between the shafts and the locked suites, a tool that had been missing from the gear locker since the very first night. The final revelation did not arrive with a scream or a struggle, but with the quiet, rhythmic hum of a smartphone recording left in a coat pocket. As I reviewed the audio from that night, the ambient noise of the storm outside faded into the background, leaving only the sound of a soft, composed voice. It was Elena. She was not the peacemaker we had all relied upon. She was the architect of our collective undoing. The recording captured her steady, chilling instructions to Marcus, coercing him into sabotaging the server cooling system to mask the physical evidence of her movements. She spoke of Topher not as a colleague, but as an obstacle that had been removed with surgical precision. The pieces of the ledger, the ones she had so carefully planted in Sarah's desk to cast suspicion, suddenly shifted in their significance. Every act of kindness she had performed throughout the retreat was merely a calculated maneuver to keep us blinded by our own internal paranoia. The ventilation shaft, the misplaced climbing gear, the forged security logs, each was a thread in a tapestry she had woven long before we reached the chalet. As the audio clip ended, the cold realization settled in that the person who had comforted us during the darkest hours was the same person who had ensured those hours were filled with terror. The loop was closed, but the consequence of her betrayal remained, echoing in the silent, empty halls of the lodge. Looking back, the silence of the lodge was a lie. It was not the quiet of peace, but the calculated stillness of a trap that had finally snapped shut. As I pieced together the final fragments of the night, the motive detached itself from the corporate veneer. It was never about the data mining or the embezzled funds. Those were merely the lures Elena used to drag us into her orbit. Her vendetta was a ghost from a past she had kept buried beneath decades of professional ambition. She operated with the patience of a predator, using the ventilation shafts to bypass the security protocols that should have kept her confined. When I found the override key tucked inside the service panel, the very key that allowed her to manipulate the server cooling system, the entire architecture of her deceit collapsed. She had forced Marcus to act, dangling his own professional ruin over him like a blade, while she orchestrated the chaos from the shadows. The climbing gear was not a tool for a rescue, but a prop for a staged tragedy, carefully positioned to lead our eyes away from the ventilation access she utilized. She banked on our fear, on our inability to trust one another, and for a long time it worked. But the audio recording, a simple device forgotten in a coat pocket, had captured the one thing she could not control. Her own voice, steady and devoid of remorse, detailing the exact moment of Topher's fall. The climax was not a physical confrontation, but the irreversible weight of physical evidence meeting a shattered narrative. With the truth laid bare, the lodge felt less like a sanctuary and more like a tomb for the secrets she had tried so desperately to keep. The aftermath left nothing but the hollow echoes of a corporate collapse. As the authorities dismantled the operation, the ledger and the voice recording became the final nails in the coffin for Elena's carefully constructed silence. The company folded under the weight of the investigations, its assets frozen and its secrets finally laid bare for the public to dissect. Looking back at the chalet, it stood as a monument to the fragility of trust when survival was the only currency. The ventilation shafts remained dark and empty, no longer serving as the veins of a desperate plan, but as reminders of how easily a sanctuary was turned into a trap. We often wonder how much of our lives depends on the integrity of those we choose to surround ourselves with. In this case, the answer was written in the cold, hard facts of the forensic report. The climbing gear was packed into evidence boxes, the server room was stripped of its illicit hardware, and the lodge was left to the silence of the mountain winds. It was a stark reminder that even the most elaborate deceptions eventually succumb to the gravity of their own falsehoods. The case closed, but the shadow of what happened in that lodge lingered, a testament to how quickly ambition can turn into a cold-blooded necessity. Thank you for walking through this dark chapter with me. If you enjoy these deep dives into the shadows of human nature, Please subscribe to Swasti Diaries for more investigations.